They picked her because she looked like an easy target. Just another quiet woman walking alone through a crowded American mall, her steps unhurried, her presence unnoticed, the kind of person people pass every day without a second thought. And that was exactly what made her perfect in their eyes, because no one ever suspects the quiet ones. No one ever questions it when authority steps in and takes control. And so when the officers closed in on her, their voices sharp, their hands already reaching, there was no hesitation, no warning, just the sudden weight of accusation pressing down in front of dozens of strangers who stopped mid-step to watch, to record, to whisper. And she didn't fight. She didn't argue. She didn't even raise her voice. There was no resistance, no sudden movement, just quiet compliance as the cold metal tightened around her wrists. And in that moment, it looked like a routine arrest. Another small incident swallowed by a busy afternoon, another story that would fade before anyone truly understood it. But what those officers didn't know, what no one in that crowd could have imagined, was that the woman they had just placed in handcuffs was not who they thought she was. Because beneath that calm expression was someone who had spent decades in courtrooms, someone who understood power, procedure, and the fragile line between justice and control. And within hours, what began as a public humiliation would begin to shift into something far larger. Something that would force every person involved to answer for what they had done. Because the woman standing there, silent and composed, was a federal judge, and the moment they realized it, everything changed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The moment the handcuffs clicked into place, the story should have been simple, clear, and easy to explain. At least that's how it usually works. An accusation is made, evidence is presented, and the situation unfolds in a way that makes sense to everyone watching. But this time, something didn't follow that pattern, something didn't add up. And even in those first few minutes, before anyone knew who she really was, there were already questions forming in the minds of the people who had stopped to watch, because no one ever said what she had taken, no item was held up, no proof was shown, just a vague accusation that hung in the air without detail or clarity. And yet the officers moved with certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided long before they ever approached her. And that raised a question that no one there could answer. Why was no stolen item ever identified? Why did the accusation remain so empty while the response was so forceful? And then there was something else. Something even harder to ignore, because in a time where nearly every officer is equipped with a body camera, where every interaction is meant to be recorded for accountability, both officers claimed theirs were not working, a coincidence that might have seemed small on its own. But placed into this moment, it felt far more significant, far more intentional. And it led to another question. Why were their body cameras suddenly not working at the exact moment they decided to make this arrest? And as the crowd watched, as more phones were raised to capture what was happening, a third question began to take shape. One that reached beyond this single moment. Beyond this one woman standing in handcuffs. How many others had this already happened to? How many people had walked through that same space, been stopped in that same way, and disappeared into a system no one fully understood? Because what unfolded in that mall did not feel like an isolated mistake. It did not feel like a misunderstanding that could be quickly resolved. It felt structured, deliberate, almost practiced, and that realization changed everything. Because this wasn't just an arrest, it may have been a system, one that operated quietly, one that relied on control, and one that counted on people never asking too many questions until it was far too late. Long before that afternoon in the mall, Judge Naomi Carter had built a reputation that carried weight far beyond the courtroom walls, a reputation shaped over more than 2 decades on the federal bench where every decision mattered and every word could change the course of someone's life. She was known for her precision, the way she listened carefully, dissected arguments, and refused to be swayed by emotion when facts told a different story. Attorneys respected her, some feared her, but all understood that once they stepped into her courtroom, there would be no shortcuts, no manipulation, no room for half-truths. Because she had spent years watching people lie under pressure, watching stories fall apart under scrutiny, and learning to recognize the smallest inconsistencies that others might miss. And it was that discipline, that calm and controlled way of thinking, that defined her even outside the courtroom. In her personal life, she was quiet, measured, someone who valued routine, and privacy, someone who moved through the world without drawing attention, which is why, on that particular day, there was nothing about her appearance that would have suggested who she really was, nothing that would have warned anyone to think twice before making a move against her. And yet, in a matter of minutes, everything she had spent a lifetime building would be tested in a way she had never experienced before. Because now she was no longer the one observing from the bench, now she was the one being watched, judged, and controlled, and the shift was immediate and unforgiving. The environment around her played its own role in what unfolded, because Briarwood Mall was designed to feel safe. Bright lights, polished floors, families moving from store to store without concern, a place where nothing serious was supposed to happen. But beneath that surface, there was another layer, one defined by constant surveillance, cameras mounted at every angle, security personnel positioned in ways that blended into the background, creating a network that saw everything while revealing very little. And for most people, that system offered reassurance, a sense of protection. But in moments like this, it became something else entirely, something that could be used not just to observe, but to control the narrative of what people believe they were seeing. Because when authority acts within a space designed for trust, few people question it. Few people stop to ask whether what they are witnessing is right or wrong. And that shift from safe to controlled happened so quietly that it was almost impossible to notice until it was too late, until someone found themselves on the wrong side of it, like Naomi had, standing there as the situation unfolded with a precision that felt far too coordinated to be random. And then there were the officers, Darius and Elliot, who moved through the scene with a level of confidence that suggested experience, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but a calm, calculated approach that revealed itself in the way they positioned themselves, the way they spoke, and the way they applied pressure without ever appearing out of control. They knew exactly how far to go, exactly how to manage the crowd, and exactly how to maintain authority in a way that discouraged interference. Their actions were deliberate, their timing precise, and there was something about their demeanor that hinted at familiarity, as though this was not a unique situation but part of a pattern they understood well, because they moved like this wasn't their first time, like they had done this before and expected it to end the same way it always did, with compliance, with silence, and with no one powerful enough to challenge them. And that assumption, more than anything else, would prove to be the mistake that changed everything. The moment didn't begin with shouting or chaos. It began quietly, almost invisibly, the kind of shift most people would never notice until it was too late. Because as Judge Naomi Carter walked through the mall, her pace steady and unremarkable, there was already a pattern forming behind her, footsteps that matched her rhythm just closely enough to go unnoticed by anyone not paying attention. Reflections in store windows that revealed movement just out of direct view, and it was in those reflections that she first saw them, not clearly at first, just shapes, figures maintaining distance but never losing position. And that was when something in her instincts sharpened, because she had seen this before in a different setting, the quiet build before a confrontation, the subtle signals that something was about to happen, and she adjusted her pace slightly, just enough to test what she was sensing. And the response came immediately. They adjusted too, confirming what she already suspected. She noticed them before they ever spoke, and in that realization, the situation shifted from ordinary to deliberate, from coincidence to intention. And yet she didn't react outwardly. She didn't turn or confront them. She simply continued walking, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, even as the distance between them slowly closed. When the stop finally came, it was sudden and public. Officer Darius stepping directly into her path with a presence that demanded attention, his voice loud enough to cut through the noise of the mall as he accused her of theft, the word hanging in the air without detail, without explanation. Just a label placed on her in front of everyone watching, and before she could respond, before she could even ask a question, Officer Elliot moved in from behind, his grip firm and forceful as he twisted her arm back, the motion sharp enough to send a jolt of pain through her shoulder, and the bag she had been holding slipped from her hand and hit the floor, a small sound that seemed almost insignificant compared to the growing tension around her, and in seconds, the scene transformed into something else entirely, a public display of authority that drew attention from every direction, people stopping, turning, pulling out their phones, recording what they believed was a routine arrest. And Naomi, despite the pain, despite the sudden loss of control, remained composed, her voice steady as she asked for an explanation, asked to see proof, asked for something that would justify what was happening. But no answer came, only more force, more commands, more pressure designed to keep her moving, to keep her silent, to keep the situation from being questioned. The crowd reacted the way crowds often do, with hesitation, with uncertainty, people watching but not stepping forward, unsure of what they were seeing but unwilling to challenge it. Because authority has a way of shaping perception, of making even the most questionable actions seem legitimate when they are carried out with confidence. And so the phone stayed raised, the whispers spread, but no one intervened, no one demanded answers. And that silence became part of the moment, part of what allowed it to continue. Because without resistance, without interruption, the officers maintained control, guiding her through the mall as if the outcome had already been decided, as if there was nothing left to prove. And yet, within that control, within that certainty, there was something missing, something that should have been there but wasn't, because no item was ever named, no evidence was ever presented, no explanation was ever given beyond the initial accusation. And for Naomi, that absence stood out more than anything else, because in all her years on the bench, she had never seen a case begin without a foundation, without a clear statement of what had actually occurred. And as she was led forward, as the situation continued without clarity, a realization began to take shape in her mind, quiet but undeniable. And that was the moment everything changed, because that was when she realized this wasn't a mistake. By the time they brought Judge Naomi Carter into the security room, the tone had already shifted from public spectacle to quiet containment, the kind of space where questions were not meant to be asked and answers were rarely given. And the first thing she noticed was not what was in the room, but what wasn't, because for a place that claimed to document incidents, the camera mounted high in the corner wasn't positioned to capture the center of the room where she stood. Instead, it angled away, just enough to miss the details that mattered, and that alone raised questions. But when she looked at Officers Darius and Elliot, when she noticed the absence of active body cameras despite standard procedure, the pattern began to form more clearly. And when she attempted to reach for her phone, to contact anyone, to assert even the smallest level of control, she was immediately blocked, her access cut off without explanation. And in that moment, the realization settled deeper, because everything about this room felt controlled, not chaotic, not rushed, but structured in a way that suggested planning, as though each step had been considered long before she ever walked through that door. What happened next only reinforced that suspicion, because it was not during the arrest, not in front of witnesses, not in the open where questions could be raised, but here, in isolation, that new evidence appeared, introduced with a level of confidence that seemed rehearsed, a small bag presented as if it had always been there, as if it had been part of the situation from the beginning. And Naomi's attention locked onto the details, the timing, the positioning, the way it was handled, because it didn't appear during the arrest, only after she was isolated, and that distinction mattered. It mattered more than anything they were saying, because in her experience, evidence that arrives late, that surfaces only when control has been established, often tells a very different story than the one being presented. And yet the narrative continued to build around it, the accusation expanding, the situation escalating, as though this new piece of information had been waiting for the right moment to be introduced, and that moment had now arrived. The transition to the jail only deepened that sense of structure, because from the moment she was processed, everything followed a rigid, impersonal routine that left no room for explanation or resistance. Requests for medical attention were dismissed without consideration despite the visible strain in her shoulder. Her attempts to make a call were delayed, redirected, minimized, each step reinforcing a system that moved forward regardless of what she said or needed. And as the charges were repeated aloud, as the story was framed in a way that suggested guilt rather than investigation, it became clear that this process was not about discovering the truth. It was about establishing a version of events that would be difficult to challenge later. And within that process, within that controlled environment, a pattern began to reveal itself, not through official statements, but through quiet observation, through the way others reacted, through the familiarity in the routine, and the thoughts settled in with increasing certainty. This wasn't just happening to her. That understanding was confirmed when she met Ruthie, a woman who had seen enough to recognize the pattern for what it was, someone who spoke in low, careful tones about others who had come through the same system, the same officers, the same sequence of events, the same escalation from minor accusation to serious charges, always following the same structure, always ending in the same outcome. And as Ruthie described it, there was no confusion in her voice, no uncertainty, only the quiet clarity of someone who had watched it happen more than once. And as Naomi listened, as each detail aligned with what she had already experienced, the scope of the situation expanded beyond a single incident, beyond a single arrest, into something far more organized, far more deliberate, because what Ruthie described was not random, it was consistent, repeatable, and effective, a process that moved quickly, that relied on pressure and control to push people through before they could fully understand what was happening to them. And in that realization, the truth became impossible to ignore, because this was not just an isolated abuse of power, it was a pipeline designed to process people before they could fight back. The moment that would change everything did not come with raised voices or dramatic movement. It came with a single sentence delivered calmly, deliberately, and without hesitation, the kind of statement that carried weight not because of how it was said, but because of what it meant. And as the tension in the room tightened, as officers Darius and Elliot continued to move forward with the same confidence they had shown from the beginning, Naomi chose that moment to speak, not to argue, not to plead, but to establish a fact that could not be ignored. And when she did, her voice remained steady, controlled, unmistakably clear as she said, "I am Judge Naomi Carter," and for the first time since this began, there was a pause, brief but undeniable, a break in the rhythm they had maintained so carefully, because in that instant, the assumptions they had built their actions on began to fracture, the certainty that had guided them shifting into something less stable, something uncertain, and even though they attempted to recover, attempted to push forward as if nothing had changed, the impact of those words lingered, altering the dynamic in a way that could not be reversed, because authority recognizes authority, and in that moment, the balance they had controlled began to shift. What followed did not happen loudly or all at once. It began quietly, through calls made, names mentioned, information moving through channels that existed beyond the control of the room she was in, because once her identity was known, once it reached the right people, the response was set into motion, a federal prosecutor stepping in, someone who understood the weight of the situation and the implications it carried, and alongside that, a retired detective whose experience brought a different kind of awareness, someone who recognized patterns not just in individual actions, but in systems, in repeated behaviors that pointed to something larger. And with their involvement, the tone began to change, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, because what had started as a contained incident was no longer isolated. It was being examined from the outside, questioned, challenged. And that shift introduced something the officers had not accounted for: oversight, scrutiny, and the possibility that their actions would not simply be accepted without resistance. At the same time, another process was unfolding, less visible but just as significant, because as attention moved toward the case, as requests for records and footage were made, something began to happen behind the scenes. Systems that should have provided clarity instead began to fail. Footage that should have been available was suddenly inaccessible. Explanations were offered but lacked detail. And the consistency of those failures raised its own set of questions, because when multiple points of evidence disappear at once, it is rarely coincidence. It suggests intention. It suggests intervention. And as witnesses who had been present in the mall began to feel pressure, subtle at first, then more direct, the pattern became harder to ignore, because the same control that had shaped the arrest appeared to be extending into the aftermath, attempting to influence what could be seen, what could be proven, and what could ultimately be believed. And as these pieces came together, as the gaps in the story became more pronounced, one conclusion began to take shape with increasing clarity, because someone was trying to erase the truth in real time. The breakthrough did not come from the systems that were supposed to preserve the truth. It came from the one place no one thought to fully control, a small kiosk positioned along the corridor where everything had begun, a camera that had been running the entire time, not focused directly on the confrontation, but capturing it through reflections in the glass surfaces nearby, angles overlapping in a way that revealed what the official footage could not. And when that recording was finally reviewed, when the sequence was slowed down and examined frame by frame, the gaps in the story began to close. Movements that had been described one way were shown differently. Moments that had been omitted were suddenly visible, and the timing of events, the force used, the absence of any clear evidence at the point of arrest, all of it came into focus with a clarity that could not be dismissed. And in that moment, the entire narrative shifted because they missed one camera, and that mistake changed everything. It turned speculation into proof. It replaced uncertainty with something concrete, and it created a record that could not be easily erased or explained away. What followed was not immediate, but it was inevitable, because once that evidence surfaced, once it began to circulate through the proper channels, the response could no longer be contained. Internal investigations were opened. Actions that had been accepted without question were now being examined under scrutiny. And the confidence that had defined Officers Darius and Elliot at the beginning gave way to something else entirely, something defensive, something uncertain, as their decisions were dissected, their reports compared against the footage, and inconsistencies highlighted in a way that made them impossible to ignore. And as the focus expanded, it did not stop with them. It moved outward, toward the systems that had enabled the situation, the procedures that had allowed it to unfold the way it did, and the environment that had made it possible for such actions to occur without immediate challenge. Because the issue was no longer just about two individuals, it was about the structure that had supported them. As investigators looked deeper, patterns began to emerge with greater clarity. Cases that had once seemed unrelated were re-examined. Similarities that had been overlooked were now impossible to ignore, and what had initially appeared as isolated incidents started to align into something more consistent, more deliberate, revealing a process that extended beyond a single moment or a single location. A process that relied on authority, on speed, on the assumption that those caught within it would not have the means or the opportunity to push back. And within that larger picture, questions arose about civil forfeiture practices, about how assets were seized, about how cases were resolved quickly under pressure, and about how often individuals found themselves navigating a system that moved faster than their ability to respond. And as those questions gained attention, the scope of the situation expanded, drawing an oversight from higher levels, bringing visibility to practices that had operated with limited scrutiny for far too long. Through it all, Judge Naomi Carter remained consistent, her approach unchanged despite everything that had happened, because for her, the focus was never on the personal impact alone. It was on what the situation revealed, on what it demonstrated about the balance between authority and accountability. And as the case moved forward, as outcomes were determined and responsibilities assigned, her perspective remained grounded in the principles she had upheld throughout her career, the belief that systems are only as strong as the willingness to question them, and that accountability does not exist without challenge. And in reflecting on what had unfolded, on how quickly control had shifted from one side to the other, her conclusion was clear, delivered with the same calm certainty that had defined her from the beginning. Justice doesn't fail in silence. It fails when no one challenges it. As the story settles and the noise fades, what remains is not just what happened to Judge Naomi Carter, but what it reveals about how easily perception can be shaped, how quickly authority can redefine a situation, and how fragile the line is between control and accountability when no one is in a position to challenge it. Because everything you've seen, every moment from that first step in the mall to the final shift in power, raises a question that goes far beyond one incident, far beyond one set of officers or one location. It forces a deeper reflection on what might have happened if the circumstances were different, if the person at the center of it all did not have the knowledge, the experience, or the access to push back against a system already in motion. And that is where the real weight of this story begins to settle, not in the outcome, but in the possibility that the outcome could have been something else entirely, something far quieter, far less visible, and far more common than most people would ever expect. So the question is, if she wasn't a federal judge, would anyone have believed her? Would the inconsistencies have been questioned? Would the missing details have mattered, or would the narrative have remained exactly as it was presented in those first moments, accepted without hesitation and recorded as fact? And as you think about that, another question naturally follows, one that reaches beyond this single case and into a broader reality. Do you think this was corruption or just abuse of power? And how many others do you think this has already happened to? How many people have found themselves in situations where the outcome was shaped before they ever had a chance to respond? Because stories like this don't exist in isolation, they exist within systems, within patterns that only become visible when someone is able to step outside of them and look back with clarity. And if you want more stories that expose what really happens behind closed doors, stories that challenge assumptions and bring hidden patterns into the light, then subscribe, because the next story takes this even further into a situation where the person at the center did not have the same leverage, did not have the same ability to turn the narrative around. And what happened next shows just how different the outcome can be when there is no one to push back. Because in the next story, the victim didn't have a way out.